on the one hand, there's some apathy towards politics, which is definitely there. And it's like, oh, I don't care. It's like they're the same, Democrats, Republicans. I don't care. Oh, what does gerrymandering do? It puts one instead of the other. Well, that doesn't matter. But there's also, I feel like, a bunch of people, like I would say a majority even, like among kids my own age, who actually do care and who are actually interested in finding solutions to problems. And I feel like to a certain extent, it's less tribal, especially like among high schoolers and young adults. It's like the tribal mentality really isn't there.
Hey everyone, it's Jenna from the Democracy Works team. As you might have seen, we are in the midst of a listener survey, which you can complete by clicking on the link in the show notes or visiting democracyworkspodcast.com/survey. We would love your feedback about what you like about the show, what you don't like, who you think we should have on as a guest, all those types of things. And please leave us your name and email at the end of the survey for a chance to win a Democracy Works coffee mug, which, as I've said before, is the perfect holiday gift for the democracy enthusiast in your life. And in the survey responses we've gotten so far, several people told us that they thought we should have more students, more young people on the show as guests. And that's exactly what we have for you today. So ask and you shall receive. Today, you're going to hear from Kyle Hynes, who is a junior at State College Area High School, and as you'll hear, a true advocate for democracy. He is the statewide champion in the youth division of the Draw the Lines Pennsylvania mapping competition and the winner of the Future Leader in Social Studies Award from the Pennsylvania Council on Social Studies. During this interview, we talk about gerrymandering, ranked choice voting, impeachment, and what seems to be a growing generational divide in politics. I am not at all ashamed to admit that Kyle taught me a thing or two during this interview. His enthusiasm, his optimism really comes through, and I hope you enjoy this conversation with Kyle Hynes. Kyle, thank you for joining us on Democracy Works.
Thank you.
So we are going to talk today about your work with Draw the Lines PA and the map that you made for them. But I also want to talk with you about impeachment and kind of what you think about democracy more broadly. As we come to the end of the year, we are interested to hear kind of a different perspective, a more youthful take on some of what's happening right now. So we'll get to all that. But first, and I think most salient, is your work with Draw the Lines PA. You are the statewide champion in the youth division.
Yeah.
Is that right? So how did you become interested in gerrymandering, and where did the idea come from to draw your own map?
So I've always been really interested in math. I've been a math geek my whole life. I've been interested in politics for quite a while. And so I'm really interested in the areas where they intersect, where math and politics kind of come together. And I feel like gerrymandering is one of those places. And like redistricting, where it's like a giant puzzle, like it's a logistical puzzle, and you try to put it together. So I've always thought this is like really interesting. And then when I saw that there was a competition, like you can draw your own map, see if you can do it better, I was like, I want to try that. So yeah, it was pretty fun.
Yeah. So you said you've been interested in politics for a while. I mean, was it something like, did your family talk politics around the dinner table, or where did that interest spark for you?
All the time. So our family's like really politically engaged, and like my political interest kind of sparked during the 2016 primaries, where it seemed almost like, especially on the Republican side, just because there were more candidates, it seemed almost like a giant game. It's like it's like the Hunger Games, who can get to the cornucopia first. Yeah. And it was like, I felt like it was really cool. I'm like, is this really how we choose our politicians? Really? And so that kind of like sparked an interest for me. And then it's kind of like carried through ever since.
Yeah. So so there's like the horse race, right? That's one thing. When did you become aware of these more kind of grassroots movements or, pro-democracy reforms, things like Draw the Lines PA and movements to stop gerrymandering?
So I really got involved with like the gerrymandering stuff. Like I first became aware that gerrymandering was a problem. I think it must have been around 2017 when we were starting to talk about the midterm elections coming up and the congressional races. And before I had like known that gerrymandering was a problem, but this was the first time I'd actually like gotten to see some of these districts, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like like, how do they benefit from that? And so I did some research, and I thought that's horrifying. And so I decided that I wanted to get involved to try to end gerrymandering. And so I joined this group called Fair Districts PA, which does a lot of like good government fair districting work in Pennsylvania. And that was kind of my first introduction with like grassroots politics.
Mm-hmm. And so what did your friends think when you were like talking about this gerrymandering stuff and getting involved in grassroots politics?
Some of my friends are interested in politics, all have a lower tolerance for politics than I do. But yeah, so sometimes there's the reaction of, oh, Kyle, just shut up about the damn politics. But often, like sometimes they are interested in politics and stuff like that. So
yeah. So when you say like a low tolerance for politics, can you just expand on that a little bit more? I think that, our podcast audience maybe tends to skew a little bit older and has different habits, different thoughts, different opinions about how they interact with politics.
Yeah. So I feel like it's interesting because among, like, at least my generation, there's, on the one hand, there's some apathy towards politics, which is definitely there. And it's like, oh, I don't care. It's like they're the same, Democrats, Republicans. I don't care. Oh, what does gerrymandering do? It puts one instead of the other. Well, that doesn't matter. They're all corrupt. They're all out for their own ends. But there's also, I feel like, a bunch of people, like, I would say a majority even, like among kids my own age, who actually do care and who are actually interested in finding solutions to problems. And I feel like to a certain extent, it's less tribal, especially like among high schoolers and young adults. It's like the tribal mentality really isn't there. Like, for instance, in our government class, when we have discussions about how to best find solutions to problems, like there's less like, oh, well, you're a Republican, I hate you. You're a Democrat, you're evil, Satan. It's more like, how do we actually find a solution across party lines to do something? So I feel like that's kind of encouraging towards the future.
And so you, through this experience of making this map, I know you testified before the Governor's Commission on redistricting, or were kind of involved in that process. You've had the chance to like engage with people from a variety of different age groups, right? And hear maybe some differences in how older generations perceive politics. Why? What do you attribute the kind of difference in mentality among you and your peers to? And do you foresee a situation or where you might end up in that more kind of entrenched position down the road?
I feel like to a certain extent, part of the reason people, at least in my generation, are more, or I don't want to say more, but like are often inclined towards being less tribal and less partisan. Part of that might just be because we haven't been through as much politically. Like, I know for most people in America, this is their second impeachment, right? This is our first. And so it's like, I feel like part of it could just be like other people have been around for longer. They've seen more. They've had more to put into their calculation of deciding what they want, like what they really want things to look like. Whereas I think there are pros and cons to not having been through as much. On the one hand, I know, like, I try to be less entrenched personally, and I know a lot of my friends do too. On the other hand, there can be a layer of naivety there, and there's less political experience. So I feel like there are pros and cons. So
you mentioned your government class earlier. Can you talk a little bit about what your civics education has been like to date?
Yeah, so through the school district, there's a certain amount of civics education. They have an 8th grade civics class, which was pretty good. And then the only thing after that is the AP government class in 12th grade. So both of those classes have certainly played a role. I feel like another big contributor to my civics education, like my parents are both really politically minded, civically minded, and they both raised me from an early age to care about this stuff. And like, yeah, it's just an election, but it can affect you, stuff like that. And they taught me to be invested in it and interested in it and do stuff to work towards what I support. So I feel like that, especially like kicking off my interest during the 2016 campaign, where we'd like sit around the dinner table, talk about politics, stuff like that. I feel like that's what kind of kickstarted it.
Yeah. Can you give me an example of something you did with your parents, or maybe a particular moment that kind of embodies that sense of civic engagement that they seem to have instilled in you?
Well, when I was, how old was I? I was 12. Oh my God.
You're so old, Kyle. All of 16 years old now.
No, so when I was 12, my dad and I would go to the gym, and they'd have CNN generally like playing on the television screens at the YMCA. So we'd be running on the treadmills, and I like oftentimes I would just watch the news, see what was going on. And then on the way home, we'd usually talk about like what had been happening in the world, like what the most recent polls were looking like, or how the Republican or Democratic primaries were taking shape. And so I felt like that was interesting. Like, and it was really great, I feel like, to actually have that experience as a really young 12-year-old who didn't know anything about politics, to be able to like talk through what was going on, like politically. And yeah, so I feel like that was a really good way to kind of get that intro.
Great. And so what was your process like for learning how to draw the map that you made for Draw the Lines PA?
I felt like I had certainly seen a lot of like alternate Pennsylvania congressional maps that people had drawn saying, hey, I can do this better than the politicians in Harrisburg. And so like I feel like I drew some from a lot of those different maps and like different attitudes towards districting. And I feel like I also kind of pulled on my math background because I wanted to create as many districts that were competitive for both sides as possible. And I feel like at some point that was just a pure puzzle. Like it was just, how do I cobble the precincts together in such a way that you get as many 50-50 districts as you can?
Yeah, so that would be competitiveness, right? There's there's several factors that can go into map making: competitiveness, compactness, on and on and on. So how did you decide which factors were most important to you, which ones to prioritize?
So I felt like I wanted to use competitive districts because, like, in my perfect world, if we had an electoral system of my choice, it would be a proportional representation system so that everyone could actually have a say in choosing the government. But obviously this competition didn't allow for that. You drew the districts. And so I felt like I wanted to draw a map that gave every single voter as much say as physically possible. And so given that voters in safe seats don't really have much of a say at all in choosing who is going to represent them, because the seat will go the same way every time, I decided that it's really important that both parties have a real chance to win any given seat. And so I feel like that kind of trumped any other issue for me, like keeping the districts compact, keeping like similar communities together, like the Lehigh Valley, Delaware Valley, stuff like that, the main line. And although I did try to do that whenever possible, I felt like it was more important to have every single Pennsylvanian have a say in who went to Congress than to have a congressman from the Lehigh Valley and a congressman from Pittsburgh and so on.
Mm-hmm. Can you just give us a quick explanation about proportional representation? You're giving us a civics lesson here today.
So proportional representation is like, it's what most countries around the world use. And as opposed to having like one representative elected from each individual district, there's a system where in some systems each voter will cast a vote for a particular party, and then candidates that were pre-selected by that party through primaries will win election to the parliament or the Congress in whatever ratio they were elected in. So if a party won half the votes, the top half of their list would make it. In other countries, they use systems where they have larger districts that elect 7 or 8 representatives, or even fewer than that, and they'll be elected by what's called a single transferable vote system, which is when voters will rank the candidates like in the order of preference from favorite to least favorite. And then they'll use an elimination system similar to ranked choice voting to actually produce a final set of candidates that is proportional to the votes cast. And so I feel like any of these systems give voters more of a say than does our current system, because our current system has safe seats, and the power of someone's vote depends on where they live. And in a lot of these other countries, which use proportional representation, that's just not the case.
Mm-hmm. So, Kyle, a lot of people that we've had on this show, when we ask them, like, what about politics gives you hope? They always say the youth, the kids. People are putting like a lot of faith in your generation, just kind of putting that out there. Are you aware of that at all? Or, I mean, do you think about that boomers and others are kind of looking to you guys to like reverse some of the mistakes that might have been made politically, or kind of how we got into some of the situations we're in today?
I mean, sometimes, yeah. But I feel like overall, I feel like the youth in any generation are always the least jaded, to put it one way. but I feel like as people go through life, they often become more and more and more jaded. But I feel like a lot of the issues that have been prevalent in the past and even today, there is, like, I certainly hope that our generation or generations above us can take care of the issues, because somebody's got to. So I feel like on the one hand, it's a little bit of pressure. Like, we're gonna give it to the youth, see what they can do with it. But on the other hand, I think, like, in the future, our generation will end up taking the reins of power, and I feel like I hope that we can do good things with them.
So you are, I'm sure, familiar with the "Okay Boomer" meme.
Yeah.
What is your biggest, like, "Okay Boomer" moment when it comes to politics or things that you think that the boomers kind of misinterpret about your generation?
Well, I feel like the "Okay Boomer" meme is kind of like I feel like it definitely, it's caught fire. I feel like it oversimplifies a lot in a way, and it it kind of alienates a huge segment of the population. Like, under the stereotype that they're just all like old white people, like, oh, they'll die eventually. Like, under that whole, so like we don't care what they think anymore or something like that. And I feel like that's kind of not what we need in our civic discourse today. I feel like it's tough to answer the question because a lot of things, even though they're like almost everything, there are a lot of people in that, like, a lot of boomers who agree with what I think and a lot who don't, and a lot of people who have been doing things to advance what we need to do in a bunch of these different categories, and a bunch who don't. But I feel like of all of the issues that I feel like older generations, like the one currently in power now in DC, has failed in, and this is not like a dispersion on any generation as a whole, but just the part of it that is currently in power, is climate change. Because I feel like they've had a long time, and by they I mean like the caucuses in Washington, a long time to deal with this, and it hasn't been dealt with. And so I feel like that's something that's going to end up being passed down to our generation, which we're going to have to deal with.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think we've heard that too. That and certainly we've seen Greta Thunberg and people kind of bringing voice to some of these things you've just articulated. The other thing that's on people's minds a lot right now is impeachment. As we sit here and record this in late November of 2019, I think it'll probably be a couple weeks before the episode comes out, but people will still no doubt be talking about it. How are you feeling about it? Is it something that, like, you and your friends are talking about, or are you talking about it in school? Help give us a window into what that looks like.
Absolutely. So I feel like this is the biggest political earthquake, if you will, that's taken place certainly within the time that I've been conscious of anything going on in the political world, that is. I feel like we've definitely talked a lot about it in our government class. We talk about it sometimes just in side conversations because it's not something that any of us have experienced before. And I feel like it's kind of bringing us into this civil dialogue as a country that has the potential, on the one hand, to tear us apart. On the other hand, I think it's really useful to actually have civil dialogue in the way that we do now.
Do you think that the dialogue happening around impeachment is civil, or what parts of it do you see as civil, perhaps?
Well, by civil dialogue, I don't mean like polite. I just mean like in like the civic sphere.
I see. Okay.
No, it's it's not, like, I feel like a lot of it is not civil in general, but again, like, I feel like a lot of, like, I have friends who support impeachment. I have friends who don't think the president should be impeached. And I feel like we're able to talk about it without, like, clawing at each other's throats. And again, part of that could just be because, for the most part, like, other high schoolers are not very politically engaged. But I feel like it could also just be, going back to what I was talking about earlier, like a sort of willingness to compromise on stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so it'll be interesting to see kind of where that all plays out, and also if that willingness to compromise kind of persists as everyone gets older. So as we start to bring things to a close here, there are 4 questions that we sometimes ask at the end of every episode. They're based on the McCourtney Institute for Democracy's Mood of the Nation poll. So we have this public opinion poll that we send out to people throughout the country, and we ask them 4 things. What in politics makes you angry, proud, worried, and hopeful. So I thought it would be interesting to maybe get your take on some of those things. So Kyle, thinking about politics and what's going on in the country and the world today, what makes you angry?
What makes me angry? I feel like the thing that makes me angriest about politics, and part of it's anger and part of it's just sadness, is that we've seen a lot of hateful rhetoric that has largely been shelved in both the U.S. and the world for decades. And it has never gone away, but I feel like it's coming back in this terrible manifestation where, like, we've seen more open racism, more open misogyny. We've seen really radical, like in a lot of countries, really radical populist movements taking power, like the Five-Star Movement in Italy, the National Rally almost in France. I feel like a lot of these places, you have a really, just really reactionary movements. And I feel like watching that kind of makes me think, why now? Why is this happening now? We've been beyond this for such a long time, or at least it's been less evident. Why now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly for your entire lifetime, I think you could probably argue. And then what makes you proud?
I feel like proud. I feel like the fact that we have in America right now so many grassroots movements that are trying to, on both sides of the political spectrum, that are trying to do what needs to be done in order, or at least what they think needs to be done, which could be different from any other person's idea of that. But I feel like the fact that they're all working in this political sphere, and that Americans are more conscious about politics than ever before, and that people are more willing to, even if it's not really that civil, at least people are talking about it, and people are realizing that all of this makes a huge difference on their lives.
What in politics or what's happening today makes you worry?
I feel like, sort of going back to my first answer about these reactionary movements on the extremes of politics, it does worry me that in a ton of countries, including in the U.S., you have kind of a hateful, vitriolic fringe that appears to be growing. So that's the one thing that would make me worried. And then secondly, just climate change. It's an unmitigated disaster.
And then finally, what gives you hope?
I feel like what gives me hope, there's a lot. I feel like it kind of, again, ties back into this, the thing I was talking about in what makes me proud. And it might even be a better answer for hopeful than it was to the first one, that we have a ton of people who actually care about politics for maybe the first time. More people voting than ever before. More people involved in politics than ever before, talking to their representatives, telling them what they think. Actually making politics a civic discourse that we haven't had in a long time. Congress is no longer some shadowy little beast in the underbelly of DC that no one pays much attention to, and they just go vote every 4 years. It's much more, many more people actually care about it, whatever side they may be on, Democrat, Republican, whatever it is, and they're more willing to actually make their voice heard. And I feel like that's a really good sign going forward, to have more political engagement.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So last question, Kyle,
Sure.
What does democracy mean to you?
It's a loaded question.
Yeah, indeed. That's why I saved it for the end.
Democracy, I feel like democracy is only, people are only actually exercising democracy when they're actually making their voices heard. I feel like it goes beyond voting. Sure, the right to vote is a key part of democracy, and you can't have democracy without it. But there's the right to, meet with your representatives. There's the right to free speech, the right to, a free press. And all of these things I feel like are so key to democracy. It's it is rule of the people, by the people, but it's also rule of the people, rule for the people. So having this, having a system where you can actually talk about what you want to talk about, you can make your voice heard, you can vote and you like a situation where every single person has the same key right to vote, which is really fundamental, and where you don't have like certain people blocking other people's right to vote or right to vote meaningfully, and so I feel like I feel like the U.S. is almost a democracy, I would want to say, where we have like so many of these key tenets. Like you have the constitutionally enshrined right to vote, whoever you are, if you're over 18. You have the right to speak your mind. You have the right to pray however you want or not at all. You have the right to a free press, all these important things. But on the other hand, I feel like we still have a slight way to go. We have, like, there is voter suppression, which is taking place in various forms. There's gerrymandering, which I feel like is honestly one of the biggest things holding us back. I feel like we do need electoral reform in a ton of different ways before we can truly be like a full democracy. And that includes, I would say, proportional representation, because your vote is not equal if you're in a safe district. And abolishing the Electoral College and reforming the Senate big time. I feel like all of these things need to be done to actually make sure that every vote is equal in the U.S. is actually a democracy. And so I feel like if you don't have the right to an equal voice, and if you don't have the right to speak your mind, then you can never have democracy.
Yeah. So Kyle, you just like summed up our entire podcast in that like 2 or 3 minutes, however long that was. Do you have questions? Are there things that you're trying to like grapple with or, turn over in your mind when it comes to politics?
Absolutely. Because I feel like especially with so much of what's going on now, like it is unprecedented in a lot of ways. And I know a lot of people, most people, obviously, who are alive now went through the Clinton impeachment inquiry. Many went through the Nixon impeachment inquiry. But this is my first time going through this, so there's a lot of, so it's new, and I'm turning a lot of it over in my head. And a lot of it's resulting in, like, well, why? Why is it this way? Why is it this way? So I feel like it's really hard to, like, get my head around. Like, even if this procedural part, like House votes by a majority, Senate votes by 2/3. Even if procedurally it's easy to wrap your head around, everything going on and the whole situation around the President Trump and the whole Ukrainian scandal is so, it's so messy and complicated. But I feel like it's really interesting to try to wrap your head around it.
Yeah. Well, Kyle, this has been a super fascinating conversation. If you are representative of your generation as a whole, I think we're all going to be just fine. I think we can kind of put that out there.
Thank
you. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us on Democracy Works.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Democracy Works is produced by the McCourtney Institute for Democracy at Penn State and WPSU Penn State, Central Pennsylvania's NPR station. Andy Grant is our engineer, and our editors are Mark Stitzer and Chris Kugler. Additional support comes from Ann Danahay, Emily Reddy, Shireen Stanford, Craig Johnson, and the rest of the team at WPSU. For more information on this episode and detailed show notes, visit our website at democracyworkspodcast.com. And if you like what you heard today, please leave us a rating or review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening.